Back in 2014, when I first started driving for Uber, there was no option for passengers to tip in the app, and Uber also discouraged drivers from accepting cash tips. Today we'll discuss this and some other things you may not have known about Uber and Lyft. When Uber originally launched, they were only their black car service, commercially licensed drivers driving high-end vehicles, town cars, and they were black cars. Then Lyft and another company called Sidecar came up with the rideshare idea, where anyone with their own personal vehicle could give rides. And this turned out to be the model for this industry, where the most rides could be given at the most affordable prices. But originally when Lyft launched, Uber viewed them as an illegal operation. They just sat back and waited for Lyft to be forcibly shut down. They thought Lyft would not exist long term. Eventually, Lyft started thriving and started taking business away from Uber, so Uber had to answer and be able to compete, and they created UberX, which is Uber's rideshare equivalent. And the rest is history. A lot of people probably think that Uber pioneered the rideshare concept, but no, it was Lyft and Sidecar that pioneered the concept that we all use today. Uber originally also did not have an option for passengers to tip in the passenger app, and Uber also discouraged drivers from accepting cash tips. When I first became a driver back in 2014, I was green. I did not know the legality of tipping. There was one time where a passenger, I had dropped them off at the airport. They had offered me a cash tip. I said, "I'm sorry, I cannot accept that," because Uber basically told me they discouraged me from accepting those cash tips. So I didn't know the legality of it. I didn't know if I was allowed to accept tips at all. I was brand new to driving rideshare or taxi in general. So this passenger tried to force the cash on me, and I just kept telling them, "No, I'm sorry, I cannot accept this tip," which was ridiculous for Uber to put that thought in my mind. Of course I can accept that cash tip. The mentality of Uber's original CEO, Travis Kalanick, was to make things as seamless as possible for passengers. He wanted passengers to be able to get in, not worry at all, just get a ride and get out and not have to worry about anything after. No review, no tipping, nothing. He wanted it to be as seamless as possible for the passenger. And early on, fares were a lot higher for drivers, so tips might not have been necessary, even though we should have been able to accept them. But then over years, Uber decided to lower fares in order to increase ridership. And if you're going to lower fares and discourage drivers from accepting tips, of course drivers are going to get pissed off. Lowering fares in general, of course drivers are going to be pissed, but you should also never discourage drivers from accepting cash tips. We're independent contractors. Now, Lyft, on the other hand, has always encouraged tips and always allowed tipping in their driver app. Uber eventually included tipping in their driver app. I think this was back in 2018, 2019. So since then, both passenger apps have had the option to tip drivers in-app. My mind is still boggled that early on, I didn't think it was okay to accept cash tips. But I was green, I didn't know any better, and shame on Uber for discouraging me from accepting those cash tips. Another thing, when I first started driving, Uber did not allow the driver app on personal phones. They gave out iPhones. I believe it was an iPhone 4, but that was my separate phone for the Uber driver app. It was not available on my personal iPhone. Again, with Lyft, they've always allowed the driver app on personal phones, and you'll see a trend here. Lyft has pioneered a lot of these things that Uber just adopted after the fact. Also, back in those first years where I started driving, there was no navigation in the driver apps. You didn't know the passenger's destination address in the driver app. You would pick up a passenger, you'd have to ask them where you're going, they would tell you the address, and then you'd have to plug that address into your own personal navigation app. I've always used Google Maps, some people use Waze, some people use Apple Maps, but navigation and knowing the destination address was not always built into the driver apps. When Lyft originally launched, they would send drivers pink fuzzy car stashes to put on the front of their cars. I actually personally have 2 of these car stashes stored away somewhere. Maybe one day they'll be collector's items, but I never put the car stash on my car. I always thought it was a little weird. And going hand in hand with that, when Lyft originally launched, they encouraged passengers to sit in the front seat and also for drivers to fist bump the passenger when they got in, to kind of create a more friendly atmosphere as opposed to a taxi service. I personally did this fist bumping a little bit, especially when someone would get in the front seat, but slowly over time I would stop doing that and leave the passengers alone. Originally, to become a Lyft driver, you would go on a test drive with what Lyft called mentors, and mentors were drivers that were approved to approve other drivers. So mentors would sit out accepting rides, and then what would happen is they would get a mentor request from a prospective driver. Those mentor sessions would take about a half hour, and those mentors were compensated for those. I remember on my mentor session, it was just a few questions. You go on a quick, I think I went on like a 5-minute test drive, and then I was approved. And also that mentor would inspect the vehicle. There wasn't official inspections back then either. Eventually, in order to keep up with scale and keep up with Uber and keep onboarding drivers at a good rate, Lyft had to get rid of these mentor sessions and just approve drivers based on background checks and vehicle inspections. Again, a lot of the concepts today that we see in the driver app, in the passenger apps, were pioneered by Lyft and Uber followed slowly thereafter. So did all of you know all these things? Also, were there things that I left out that I should have included? Leave a comment below and let us know. Thanks again for watching, and drive safe. Thanks.